The morning William Blackstone told me to stand up and apologize to his son in front of 12 board members, I almost smiled. Not because I was comfortable, not because I was brave, but because I knew something no one else in that room knew yet. The federal agents were already on their way. I had been at Apex Defense Technologies for 22 years. I had started on the production floor with grease on my hands and worked my way up through every level of aerospace manufacturing. I knew the materials, the tolerances, the failure points, the inspections, and every safety standard we were legally bound to meet. In our business, those standards were not bureaucratic paperwork. They were the difference between a military aircraft completing its mission and a crew that never came home. William Blackstone had built the company from the ground up, and for most of those years, he had built it right. But somewhere along the way, he decided that the most important thing he could build was a future for his grandson, and that decision was about to cost him everything. Andrew Blackstone was 32 years old, Stanford MBA, and the newly promoted VP of Strategy. He had arrived at Apex 6 months earlier in a custom suit and a brand new Tesla, full of polished phrases about lean manufacturing and strategic optimization. He had never stood on a production floor at 2 in the morning trying to solve a tolerance failure. He had never signed his name to a component that someone's life might depend on. But according to William, he was the future of the company. According to the rest of us, he was a disaster waiting for altitude. And if I did not stop him, my name would be buried under the wreckage. I want to tell you exactly how it happened. Not the version where the good guy wins easily. The real version, where I made mistakes, where I came close to losing everything, and where the truth almost did not make it out of that building in time. But first, make sure you subscribe to Alex's Revenge Justice, because this is the kind of story where the truth does not just come out. It walks into the room with federal credentials and a set of handcuffs. Before I became the man William Blackstone tried to destroy in a boardroom, I was a Marine sergeant. 12 years of service. I learned what it meant for equipment to either work when lives were on the line or not work, and what that second option cost. When I left the military and started at Apex, I came in through the shop floor the same way I came into everything, from the bottom. I wanted to understand every machine, every material, every inspection, every place where a small decision made a large difference. I spent 4 years on the floor before I moved into quality assurance, 4 more before I was leading the engineering compliance team. By the time I had my own office, I had personally overseen the design, testing, and certification of components used in C-130 transport aircraft, F-16 support systems, and 3 generations of helicopter maintenance hardware. I did not come to work for a salary. I came because my son, Danny, was serving as an Air Force crew chief. He was the one physically signing off on whether those aircraft were safe to fly. Every rivet I certified, every stress test I approved, every inspection standard I defended in meetings with procurement officials. That was my son's safety. That was every crew chief like him. That was real. For 22 years, Apex had been one of the defense industry's most trusted smaller contractors. Our relationships with Pentagon procurement were built on one thing. We did not cut corners. When we found a problem, we reported it. When a standard needed to be met, we met it, even if it cost us the contract. That reputation had taken 2 decades to build. It took Andrew Blackstone less than a month to start dismantling it. His first proposal landed in my inbox on a Wednesday morning. Reduce materials testing protocols by 50% across all current contract lines. The justification was 6 slides of lean manufacturing terminology and a projected savings figure that looked impressive until you understood where the money was actually coming from. He had circled it in blue on slide 4, labeled it Operational Efficiency Phase 1, and scheduled a meeting with my entire engineering team to present it. I read the proposal twice to make sure I had not misunderstood. I had not. Our contracts required specific safety certifications, stress testing, and material verification at every stage of production. Not because we had chosen to. Because federal law required it as a condition of holding a defense manufacturing contract. Every test Andrew wanted to eliminate existed because, at some point in the history of aerospace engineering, something had failed, people had died, and the industry had written the lesson into the rule book. You did not skip those steps to improve profit margins. You skipped those steps and hoped no one was flying what you built. I pulled Andrew aside before the meeting. I explained it to him simply, the way I would explain it to a new technician on his first week. These are not preferences. These are federal requirements. This is not traditional thinking versus modern thinking. This is physics. Aluminum cannot do what titanium does. A reduced stress test does not reveal what a full stress test reveals. The FAA and Pentagon do not care about your MBA. They care about whether the component holds. Andrew smiled at me the way you smile at someone you have already written off. Mike, he said, I understand you're comfortable with the traditional approach, but we need to embrace where manufacturing is going. My father expects results, not status quo. That was the first time I understood the real problem. He was not inexperienced and eager to learn. He was inexperienced and certain he was right. There is no more dangerous person in a technical environment than someone who does not know what they do not know, and who mistakes that ignorance for confidence. I went to William the next morning. I laid the engineering reports across his desk. I walked him through exactly what Andrew's proposal would do: eliminate required testing, weaken material standards, and produce components that would pass paperwork review while failing real-world performance demands. I brought the federal contract language and highlighted the specific clauses we would be violating. William barely looked at the documents. He leaned back in his chair and gave me the expression he reserved for people who were about to be reclassified as problems. Michael, Andrew has advanced training from one of the top institutions in the country. He understands strategic optimization better than traditional operators. There it was. Traditional operators. 22 years of keeping Apex compliant, keeping our contracts clean, keeping people alive, reduced to a polite way of saying you are old and you are in the way. I told him straight. Physics did not bend for Stanford degrees. Aluminum was not titanium just because a spreadsheet made it look cheaper. If we submitted non-compliant components under a defense contract, we were not cutting corners. We were committing federal fraud. William's expression did not change. Adapt to Andrew's approach, he said, or start thinking about whether this is still the right fit for you. I went back to my office and sat with that for a long time. I thought about Danny. I thought about the crew chiefs signing off on the equipment we built. I thought about 22 years of work and what it would mean if I walked away now. And then I thought about what it would mean if I stayed quiet. The next 3 months were a slow unraveling that I watched from inside the machine. Andrew stopped asking for my input and started overriding it. He showed up in engineering meetings he had not been invited to and interrupted technical discussions with phrases designed to sound authoritative without containing any actual technical content. Whenever I pushed back on a specification change, he would smile and say he would circle back with William. And then the change would go through anyway, with my name attached as the reviewing engineer. That was the part that kept me awake at night. He was not just making bad decisions. He was using my name to give those decisions credibility. My 22 years of reputation at Apex was the cover story for his incompetence, And if anything went wrong, the signature at the bottom of those forms was mine. When federal inspectors visited the facility and asked real technical questions, Andrew would suddenly step back. "Michael can explain that part," he would say, generous as anything. Then, in private conversations with William that I was not supposed to hear, he would describe those same moments as evidence of my poor communication and resistance to change. 3 of my best engineers transferred out that quarter. Tony Castellano, our union rep and a former Navy machinist with 20 years of fabrication experience, came to me quietly one afternoon and told me what was really happening. Andrew had made it clear through back channels that anyone seen as aligned with me had no future under the Blackstones. Tony had heard it directly from one of the junior managers at a Thursday lunch. He told me he was staying. He also told me to be careful. I did not know yet how much Tony knew or how important he was about to become. The breaking point came on the night before our FAA compliance review. I was still in the building past 9, going over the North Star contract documentation for the 3rd time. The production floor was dark and quiet. Most of the offices on my floor had been empty for hours. I was walking back from the printer room when I heard voices coming from the main conference room, and the door was not fully closed. I stopped. It was William and Andrew. Andrew sounded nervous in a way I had not heard from him before. Not uncertain, actually nervous. "Dad, what happens if the FAA asks technical questions I can't answer tomorrow?" William's answer was calm. "Practiced. Don't worry. I've already briefed the procurement team that Michael has been resistant to efficiency improvements. If there are any technical issues during the review, we will frame them as his failure to provide adequate documentation support." My hand went cold. I had my phone in my pocket. I did not think about it for more than 2 seconds. I pressed record. Andrew asked, what would happen if the inspector wanted to see the original specifications? William told him the original specifications were outdated and overly conservative. He told Andrew that after tomorrow's review, Andrew would be leading the entire department. I stood in that hallway for 4 more minutes and did not move. When their voices stopped and I heard chairs moving, I walked quietly back to my office, closed the door, transferred the recording to my personal cloud storage, sent a copy to my personal email, and then sat down and thought about what I had just heard. This was not careless management. This was a plan. They were going to let the federal review happen, blame any technical problems on my resistance to change, and then promote Andrew over a department where I had been professionally neutralized. And if the falsified specifications ever became a legal problem, they already had the narrative built. The old engineer who would not adapt had failed to properly document the transition. I would be the scapegoat for decisions I had fought against every step of the way. I went home that night and I did not sleep. But I also did not panic. I had spent 12 years in the military learning what panic costs you, and 22 years after that learning what careful preparation earns. If they wanted a paper trail, I was going to build one they would never be able to take apart. Starting the next morning, I documented everything. Every email thread involving specification changes, I flagged, copied, and archived to a personal secure drive. Every meeting note, every version history of every engineering file Andrew had touched. I pulled the original North Star contract requirements from secure storage and compared them line by line against the versions Andrew had been distributing under my name. What I found was worse than I expected. The changes were not scattered or random, they were systematic. Across 23 separate line items in the North Star specifications, Andrew had altered material requirements, removed inspection stages, reduced stress testing cycles, and weakened certification standards that our contract legally required us to meet. Some of the changes were subtle enough that they might slip past a non-specialist. But the most dangerous one was obvious if you knew what you were looking at. My original specifications called for titanium grade 5 with verified heat treatment and hardness levels for the primary wing attachment components. Andrew's version substituted aluminum 6061. Titanium grade 5 has a tensile strength of approximately 130,000 pounds per square inch. Aluminum 6061 has a tensile strength of approximately 45,000 pounds per square inch. On a spreadsheet, the substitution looked like a cost-saving breakthrough. In a military aircraft at altitude and load, it looked like catastrophic structural failure. And every page of those altered specifications listed me as the reviewing engineer. 2 nights after I finished my documentation, my personal cell phone rang from a number I did not recognize. It was Tony. He told me to write down the address he was about to give me and to come alone, and not from the Apex parking lot. That was how I ended up at Murphy's Diner, a 24-hour truck stop about 15 miles outside town, sitting across from Tony, in a back corner booth at 11:30 at night while rain came down against the windows. We both ordered coffee, neither of us touched. Tony slid a folder across the table without saying anything first. Inside were printouts of network activity logs, my company computer, my office phone, every file I had opened, every email I had sent from inside the building, every call I had made from the company line. The logs ran back 2 months. William had been monitoring me since before Andrew arrived. Then Tony showed me the second part of the folder. Apex's internal surveillance was not just on me. Ashley Blackstone, William's granddaughter and Andrew's cousin, had been moving through the building with a device that recorded ambient audio in meeting rooms, break rooms, and private offices. Her name appeared on dozens of files stored in a secure folder on the executive server that Tony had accessed through a union grievance investigation. As our union rep, he had formal rights to review certain company records related to employee discipline and monitoring. What he found went far beyond standard HR documentation. William had surveillance files on board members. He had files on senior staff members. He had files on anyone who had ever questioned him in a room where Ashley had been present. I put the folder down and looked at Tony. "How long has this been going on?" he said. The surveillance pattern went back at least 3 years. Then he told me about the others. Thomas Anderson from Quality Control had been pushed out 18 months earlier after William discovered he was dealing with a personal financial hardship. William had made it quietly clear that the information could find its way to the Security Clearance Review Office if Thomas did not resign. Lisa Martinez from Procurement had quit 8 months ago after Ashley recorded her criticizing Andrew's qualifications in a private lunch conversation. William turned that recording into a formal HR complaint and gave Lisa a choice between a termination with cause notation or a quiet resignation. Both of them left Apex with clean exit packages and signed non-disclosure agreements that kept them silent. That was the system, not just nepotism, not just bad management. A controlled environment built on surveillance, leverage, and quiet threats dressed up as professional transitions. William had not built a company. He had built a cage with a very expensive lock. Tony leaned across the table and told me that if I was going to fight this, I needed someone William could not threaten, discredit, or outmaneuver with money. Then he gave me a name: Colonel Patricia Hendricks. I knew Patricia as a board member, one of the few Apex had who was not there primarily because of her investment stake. What I did not fully know was her background, Tony told me. Patricia had spent 15 years as an Air Force procurement officer before she retired. She had overseen defense contracts, supplier audits, and federal compliance investigations for her entire career. She had not joined the Apex board for the dividends. She had joined because she still cared about where military equipment came from. According to Tony, Patricia had been watching the numbers for months. Delivery timelines slipping. Quality deviation reports climbing quietly, while publicly reported margins went up. Andrew's efficiency improvements producing savings that did not add up to anyone who understood manufacturing costs at a technical level. She suspected something was wrong. She did not have what I had. Tony had already arranged a meeting for the following afternoon at a coffee shop downtown. The cover story was a technical briefing for a routine investment review. Patricia thought she was getting a quarterly update on North Star production status. She was going to get something else entirely. I arrived at Riverside Coffee before Patricia did and found a table in the back corner. She walked in exactly on time, sat down across from me, ordered a black coffee, and said nothing until I opened the folder. She scanned the first page for about 30 seconds, then turned to the second without looking up. By the fourth page, she set down her coffee and did not pick it up again. "Michael," she said, "these aren't cost-saving measures. These are federal contract violations." She did not say it with shock. She said it with the specific quiet anger of someone who had spent her career making sure these things did not happen and was now looking at proof that they had. Patricia pulled out her own folder. For 6 months, she had been tracking financial anomalies across Apex's contract portfolio. Not enough to act on alone, but enough to know something was being manipulated. She had cross-referenced delivery reports with production cost data and found that 8 Pentagon contracts showed a combined savings figure of $28 million across 18 months. Savings that size, spread that way, across contracts with our technical requirements, meant one of two things. Either Apex had made an engineering breakthrough that the rest of the aerospace manufacturing industry had somehow missed, or someone had been substituting materials. She laid her numbers next to mine. Together, they told the complete story. Patricia looked at me and said something quietly. "This is bigger than North Star." We spent the next hour planning. Patricia would contact her former Pentagon procurement connections and request an immediate compliance audit on the North Star contract. Not an internal review that William could manage. Not a friendly inspection where he could control the room. A formal federal audit requested by a sitting board member with active industry credentials and an existing relationship with military procurement oversight. If federal investigators compared the original contract requirements against Andrew's altered specifications, they would find everything I had already found with the authority to act on it. Patricia was clear about one thing. William would not go quietly. The moment he felt threatened, he would attack my credibility with everything he had. He would use the surveillance files. He would use the monitoring logs. He would turn every piece of evidence against me if he could. So we needed to be ready for that too. Tony prepared a formal union grievance filing that documented the unauthorized employee surveillance, which created a protected legal record before William could move to suppress it. Patricia prepared a written report of her financial concerns as a board member, which created an independent paper trail separate from my documentation. I organized my engineering files, comparison reports, version histories, and the conference room recording into a single package and handed it to an attorney the following morning. And then we did the hardest thing. We waited. William moved faster than any of us expected. On the Monday after our meeting, Ashley appeared at my office door with that smooth Blackstone family smile, the one that had never quite reached her eyes in all the time I had known her. "Grandfather wants to see you. He says it's about finalizing the transition plans." I knew what that meant. When I walked into William's office, Andrew was already seated beside his grandfather, and there was a third person in the room I had not seen before. A man in a gray suit with an FAA compliance badge clipped to his jacket pocket. Inspector Williams. My pulse spiked once, then steadied. William gestured me to a chair with the casual confidence of a man who believed he had already won. Inspector Williams opened a folder and placed a set of documents on the desk. Andrew's altered North Star specifications, every dangerous substitution, every removed inspection, every weakened standard, with my name listed as the reviewing engineer on every page. William spoke before the inspector could. "Inspector, we appreciate your time today. We've asked Michael here because we've identified some serious documentation irregularities in the North Star compliance reports, and we want to make sure there's full transparency." "Full transparency?" I looked at the documents. Aluminum where titanium was required. Stress testing reduced by 40%. Heat treatment protocols removed entirely. And my signature block at the bottom of each page. Andrew crossed his arms and leaned back slightly. Inspector Williams looked at me directly. "Mr. Thompson, can you explain why these North Star specifications don't match the original procurement requirements?" The room was quiet enough that I could hear the ventilation system running above us. For a moment, I felt the full weight of what was happening. They had built this trap over months. William had briefed the procurement team. Andrew had used my name as a shield. And now a federal inspector was sitting across from me with documents that appeared to show I had approved the very changes I had fought against. I looked at the specifications one more time. Then I pushed the folder back across the desk. I never approved these specifications. Andrew came forward immediately. "Michael, we discussed these optimization measures in multiple engineering reviews. You were present for the finalization discussions. You reviewed the updated compliance documentation." William added his note calmly. "Inspector, I have to be transparent. Michael has struggled with the modernization process. We may be looking at a documentation gap caused by a communication breakdown on his end." There it was, the pivot point they had been building toward for months. Everything designed to land in this moment, in this room, with a federal official watching. I let them finish. Then I said, "Inspector Williams, I am formally requesting a review of all engineering documentation associated with the North Star contract. These specifications were altered without my authorization, submitted under my name without my knowledge, and represent systematic fraud against a federal defense contract. I have extensive documentation supporting that claim." William's face did something small but visible, a tightening around the jaw, a fraction of a second where the executive composure slipped. The inspector looked at him. Then he closed his folder. Given the nature of these contracts and the seriousness of these claims, a formal review is exactly what's required. And that was the moment their trap closed on them instead of me. What happened in the next 72 hours moved faster than anything I had experienced in 22 years at Apex Defense Technologies. Inspector Williams secured the building's document servers within the hour. By midday, federal investigators had arrived with preservation orders and were copying every email chain, engineering file, procurement record, and version history connected to the North Star contract. Employees were called into private interviews, one at a time throughout the afternoon. William spent the first several hours working the hallways. Calm voice, reassuring handshakes. telling senior staff this was a routine compliance matter and that it would be resolved quickly. I watched him from across the open floor and thought about how many times he had managed a room exactly that way. How many times people had believed him because he delivered fear in the voice of a reasonable man. By 5 that evening, the investigators had everything. My documentation. Tony's surveillance records, submitted through the union grievance channel and therefore legally protected. Patricia's independent financial report. The engineering comparisons. The version histories showing exactly when each specification was altered and under which login credentials. And the conference room recording. After the agents left for the evening and the building had mostly emptied, William shut his office door and turned on me in the hallway with the kind of quiet fury that does not raise its voice because it does not need to. "You have no idea what you just started." I looked at him. "Yes," I said, "I do." The next morning arrived with cold rain and federal audit teams walking through the Apex lobby before most employees had their first coffee. 4 technical specialists, 2 criminal investigators, and a Pentagon procurement liaison who had flown in overnight. They set up in the main conference room, secured the server room, and began a systematic review of every contract in Apex's active portfolio. At 10 in the morning, William called an emergency board meeting. Even with federal investigators working 40 feet down the hall, he stood at the head of the boardroom table and attempted to run the room the way he always had. He described the audit as an unfortunate misunderstanding. He called Andrew's work exceptional. He said that the investigation had been triggered by a disgruntled employee who had been resistant to modernization and had escalated his personal frustrations through improper channels. Everyone in the room understood who he meant. Andrew sat beside him with his hands folded on the table, doing his best to look like a man who had nothing to worry about. Then Patricia spoke. Her voice was measured and precise, the way it gets when someone has been waiting for exactly this moment. "William, are you specifically referring to Michael Thompson's technical concerns about specification violations on the North Star contract?" The room shifted in a way you could feel without looking around. William started to answer, but I was already standing. "I would like to show the board what was actually changed." I connected my tablet to the boardroom display and put up the first comparison slide. Original North Star specification on the left. Andrew's revised version on the right. Titanium grade 5 on the left. Aluminum 6061 on the right. Tensile strength of 130,000 pounds per square inch on the left. Tensile strength of 45,000 pounds per square inch on the right. Required heat treatment on the left. None on the right. Then I moved through the other 22 items. The room was absolutely silent by the third slide. These were not efficiency optimizations. Every person in that room who understood aerospace manufacturing, and several of them did, could see exactly what they were looking at. Safety margins being traded for savings. Military-grade requirements being replaced with consumer-grade alternatives. Andrew stood up. "Those were preliminary study documents. I'm on record as requesting Michael's final review before anything was submitted." I looked at him. "Andrew, I never reviewed them because you never sent them to me before submission. You used my name without my authorization." William raised his voice for the first time that morning. "That recording is taken completely out of context, and I have serious questions about its legality." I had not mentioned a recording yet. The board members noticed that. I reached for my phone. "Let me play something for the room." And then Andrew's voice came out of the speaker. "Dad, what happens if the FAA asks technical questions I can't answer tomorrow?" And then Williams, "Don't worry. I've already briefed the procurement team that Michael has been resistant to efficiency improvements. If there are technical issues, we'll frame them as his failure to provide adequate support. The silence that followed was different from the silence during the slides. That silence had been professional. This one was something else. Several board members were no longer looking at the table. They were looking at William. Patricia's face was completely still. William opened his mouth. Then a voice came from the back of the room. Mr. Blackstone. Inspector Williams had stepped through the boardroom door. 2 federal agents stood behind him. In his hand was a folder I recognized from the documentation package I had submitted. Our preliminary review has confirmed unauthorized specification changes were submitted under Mr. Thompson's name across the North Star contract. We have also confirmed internal communications demonstrating intent to misrepresent those changes to federal procurement officials. He turned to face the 3 Blackstones directly. William Blackstone, Andrew Blackstone, and Ashley Blackstone, you are under arrest on charges of conspiracy to defraud the United States government. For the first time in 22 years, William Blackstone had nothing to say. What happened next was not dramatic in the way movies make things dramatic. It was methodical and quiet and final. Phones were placed on the table. Laptops were collected. The company's servers remained under federal hold. Ashley, who had been standing near the wall since the meeting started, sat down heavily in a chair and started crying before the agent even reached her. Andrew stood very still while his rights were read to him. Like if he did not move, none of it would be real. William kept his posture straight until the handcuffs went on. The charges covered conspiracy to defraud the federal government, falsification of defense contract documentation, and violations of procurement law tied to components that active military units had been depending on. The investigation took 3 months from that boardroom to sentencing. Federal auditors pulled every active Apex contract and found that North Star was not the only one. Over 18 months, specification alterations had been made across 8 separate defense contracts. Each change had been designed to look like an efficiency improvement. Each one produced measurable savings. Combined, they totaled $28 million in fraudulent cost reductions. $28 million bought by quietly removing the protections that kept military crews safe. William pled guilty. He received 6 years in federal prison and was ordered to pay $8.5 million in fines and restitution. Andrew was permanently banned from all government contracting and faced civil liability claims from multiple military units affected by the compromised components. His career in defense manufacturing was over before it had ever actually begun. Ashley cooperated with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. She lost her security clearance, accepted 2 years of probation, and gave testimony that helped the government trace the full extent of the surveillance operation William had run against his own employees. 3 months after the arrests, I walked into what had been William's office for the first time as its new occupant. Senior Vice President of Engineering. Not handed to me. Voted by the board after Patricia helped rebuild the leadership structure from the ground up with proper governance. I had accepted the role on one condition, that we hire back every engineer Andrew had driven out, if they wanted to come back. Most of them did. Our team went from 13 to 19. Every new member hired on technical merit. Every promotion earned. No more back-channel threats. No more monitored conversations. No more resignation letters drafted under duress. Tony was formally recognized in a board resolution for his role in the investigation. His union protection standards were written into Apex's governance policy so that no future executive could conduct unauthorized employee surveillance without triggering immediate legal consequences. Patricia became chair of the board, and for the first time in years, Apex Defense Technologies had real oversight from someone who understood what we actually built and what the consequences were when we built it wrong. The culture changed in ways I had not predicted. Engineers started raising concerns again. Quality control reports started telling the truth even when the truth was expensive. Procurement meetings became actual discussions instead of performance sessions designed to produce a predetermined result. People stopped lowering their voices when they walked past an executive office. I still think about that boardroom morning sometimes. The 12 faces around the table. Andrew's smug posture. William's steady executive voice. And I think about the version of me that might have stood up that day and apologized. Who would have believed William's framing? Who would have thought his power was permanent? Who would have quietly accepted the demotion and signed the exit paperwork and gone home with a damaged reputation and a story he could never tell anyone? I think about Thomas Anderson and Lisa Martinez, who had faced the same machine and had not had a Tony or a Patricia standing behind them. I think about the crew chiefs like Danny who had been depending on our work without knowing someone had been quietly replacing the materials underneath them. If there is one thing I want you to take from this story, it is not about revenge. I did not want William Blackstone's career. I did not want his office or his title or his money. I wanted the components to be right. What saved me was not cleverness, it was documentation. Every email, every version file, every meeting note, every altered specification I could prove I had never approved. That paper trail was the only thing that stood between me and a federal scapegoat charge that would have ended my career and potentially sent me to prison for someone else's decisions. If you are ever in a situation where someone is using your name as cover for their mistakes, do not argue louder. Document quieter. Find the allies who cannot be bought or threatened, and wait for the right room. Because corruption only survives when honest people decide the documentation is too much trouble.
If this story stayed with you, I want to know what you would have done. Would you have confronted them the moment you found out? Or would you have stayed quiet and built the case?
Tell me in the comments. And if you believe that the truth eventually finds its own way into the right room, subscribe to Alex's Revenge Justice. Because sometimes justice does not announce itself. It just walks through a door you already left open.